the vast majority of philosophers don't even accept that free will exists.
As it's an argument in logic, you only need to say if free will exists, that would be a defeater. Free will exists within the Christian worldview, therefore it's not a defeater. Philosophers distinguish between moral suffering and natural suffering. If it's not immoral, then it doesn't pose a challenge rationally to the existence of a moral God.
Can God create a truly free moral agent like us, where we only choose to do good things? Will there be suffering in heaven? Will there be evil in heaven? Would you say the majority of people are destined for hell?
Jesus says it's not about how good you are or think you are, or whether you can earn your way by morality to be good enough to get into the good place.
Not to put you on the spot, but do you feel like there is anything that could convince you back again?
Many people have asked me that, and in fact you did last time, if you recall. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to the Unbelievable podcast, the show where Christians and non-Christians come together to debate the topics that matter to all of us. I'm Ruth Jackson, and today we've got a fascinating debate which was recorded in front of a live audience at St Michael's Catholic School in Aylesbury with the support of Aylesbury Vale Youth for Christ. We're going to be tackling the tragically perennial question, does suffering disprove the existence of God? My guests today are Harry Amos, an agnostic atheist who blogs at the Book of Amos, and Simon Edwards, a former lawyer who is now an adjunct speaker at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and the author of the book, The Sanity of Belief.
Harry, would you mind just giving us a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of your journey from non-belief into non-belief?
So I originally went to a Church of England school. Often it is the case that people who go to Christian schools end up almost immunised to faith through their experiences. I was one of those. I came out almost precocious a little bit as an atheist. Oh, I'm an atheist, Dawkins-esque, aged 11. My brother and I, he's 6 years older than me, 6.5. We've always been really close. He came back from a evangelical Christian youth camp, I think is my memory. He was always a lovely person, still is, but he came back and he started caring about issues of justice and the environment. And I thought, this is really interesting. I didn't know that a Christian, becoming a Christian would change you as a person, that you'd actually start caring about the world we live in and how we can live better lives and change the world for the better. He invited me to church. I thought, well, I've been to church growing up, it was boring, Christians are hypocrites, but then I went to an evangelical church, heard preaching about God's love, his forgiveness, became an evangelical Christian, very committed over the period of when I was maybe 12 to when I went to university. I started having doubts, primarily about whether the Bible contains an accurate record of history. It's a bit of a technical subject, but I came to believe that lots of things, lots of narratives in the Bible that are presented as history are historically false, in simple terms. And then brick by brick, my kind of worldview started to come under more doubt. So I started to kind of doubt the reconcilability, I'll make that a word, of science and faith, and the existence of God and all sorts of big questions. And I eventually kind of came to what I call agnostic atheism. Atheism being, I don't positively believe that there is a God, but agnosticism, I don't know that. And not to trivialize things, but it is analogous to say, I don't positively believe that there are invisible unicorns in this room, but I don't know that because they would of course be invisible. We wouldn't be able to detect them. So even though that sounds almost facetious, but the kind of point is I'm not claiming to know or be able to disprove God. I just don't believe that he exists.
Brilliant, thank you, Harry. And Simon, just a brief summary of your journey.
Absolutely. But hello, everyone. It's a delight to be back here, and it was a delight to meet Harry last night as well at Pizza Express. And just to say, I really appreciate Harry's thoughtfulness about these things, and I've also appreciated your thoughtfulness as the sort of questions that you ask as well. Very briefly, I grew up in a completely non-religious family home in Australia. My closest thing to a god was sport, probably. I played cricket and tennis and rugby and athletics. But when I hit my mid-teens, that midway point between childhood and adulthood, I started to do something which I'd never really done before, which was think. And I started to think, what the heck is my life all about? And I just remember standing in the school playground at lunchtime and thinking to myself, is it true that we just live for 80 or 90 years, if we're lucky, and then we die, and then that's just it, just game over? And everything that we've loved and everything that we've achieved and everything that we are just dissipates into dust. And I remember thinking, if that's true, it would seem to render life meaningless. I wonder if it is true. So for me, that was a catalyst, the beginning of a journey for me to try to figure out what is life actually all about. And so I started going to the library and I started reading something called books, which we used to have back then before the internet. And I started reading about different religions and different philosophies, trying to figure out what's true. Now, what my mum always said about me was that I was the sort of person who wouldn't believe anything just because somebody said it. She said this was very annoying. She said that was so annoying that I'd probably end up growing up to be a lawyer, which happened, in fact. So mothers are always right. So anyway, I had to investigate things for myself, and to cut a long story short, over a period of time, I came to the intellectual conviction, looking at evidence from science and from history and from great thinkers and from the Bible itself, that Christianity made far better sense of life, the universe, and everything, including my experiences as a human being, than everything else, and that it was true. It was quite a bit later that I actually became a Christian after spending time reading the Bible and over time falling in love with the person of Jesus, because I came to realize how much he loved me. And then it was after, probably about 2 or 3 years after, that I started going to church, because I didn't know anyone who went to church. So that, in brief, is a little bit about my backstory.
Harry, for so many people, the problem of suffering is the biggest objection to their belief in God. Do you think that is the biggest objection personally? But also, why do we call it a problem of suffering? Would you just lay out very briefly why it's a problem?
Sure. So I can't recall the statistics. Might have been helpful if I looked up beforehand, but I would probably, based on anecdotal evidence, say the problem of suffering is a key reason, maybe the biggest, why people struggle to believe in the God of at least most people's worldwide faith as a omnibenevolent and all good, all loving and all powerful God. So there was a guy called Epicurus who kind of first, this is an ancient philosopher who first came up with a neat way of summarizing the problem of suffering, the problem sometimes as the problem of evil. And he said, if God is all-loving, if he wants to prevent evil but cannot, then he's not omnipotent. If he can prevent evil but chooses not to, then he's not omnibenevolent. If he is both omnibenevolent, if he can stop evil and he wants to, then why is there evil? And then if he's not omnipotent and not omnibenevolent, why call him God? So that's, I guess, a summary of what is sometimes called the Epicurean dilemma. So that is probably something that's on the religious studies curriculum, so hopefully I've ticked off that box. So sometimes suffering is really difficult because we all know in our everyday lives, when you stub your toe, you go, that's suffering. But then, on the grandest of scales, it can be really difficult to appreciate how much suffering there actually is in the world. I think one of the most obvious examples that we would go to is the Holocaust. And you hear such massive numbers, 17 million people suffered at the hand of Nazi Germany. And they were imprisoned, they were tortured, and they were killed. And it's difficult to get that number in your head, but I think I was told there's maybe about 200 people in this room. That, you have to imagine, happened to every single one of you in this room. And that there were 8,500 or so of these rooms to which of people like yourselves that also happened to. And that gives you a little bit of the sense of how, and that's just one instance. There are, unfortunately, hundreds, of instances of genocide and war. I won't, give a long list because I don't think that's why I'm here, and then you might all leave very sad. But I guess one key thing to note here is that the problem of suffering, as I see it, is that my friend here, Simon, the burden is almost on him to demonstrate that all instances of suffering, more probably than not, have a justification that sits behind them. If there is even one instance of suffering that has no justification or probably doesn't have a justification, then the objection of the problem of suffering stands, that there is not an all-powerful, all-loving God that exists. And I guess I'll stick with that. Now, I imagine Simon will present various defences during the course of this discussion. And to some extent, I will attempt to say which of the either omnipotence or omnibenevolence qualities that I think that Simon has abandoned as part of his explanation.
Thank you, Harry. That was a really helpful summary. So in light of that, is it possible to reconcile a belief in God with the problem of suffering that Harry's just laid out?
Yes, it is, but it's not easy and it's not simplistic. I'd like to start by saying I agree with Harry that suffering is probably the number one piece of evidence against the existence of a good and loving God. Certainly, if I was going to try to argue the existence of a good and loving God, I wouldn't start with suffering. I would start with a whole lot of other evidence, such as the scientific evidence and the historicity of the Bible and evidence for the resurrection and all sorts of stuff. But suffering stands as the one big thing saying, how can you possibly believe in a good God with all this suffering? Harry mentioned sort of an Epicurean objection, which sometimes might be called, and has been summarized as the logical problem of evil. If you study this in your curriculum, you will know that the logical problem of evil is no longer considered a good philosophical argument against the existence of God in and of itself. There's been a defeater to that argument, which you might have come across a philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga in something called the best of all possible worlds defense, or the free will defense, which I'll just say very briefly is the idea that if God truly is a loving God, then he would want to create the best of all possible worlds. And the best of all possible worlds is a world in which there are beings who are capable of love. And for beings to be capable of love, they must have free choice in their actions. Because love that's not freely given is not truly love. If I asked my wife to marry me, but was holding a baseball bat or a gun to her head saying, will you marry me, and using coercion, that wouldn't really be love. It's not true love. And so God wants a relationship of love, but free will also implies the possibility of choosing against God's will, which can result in suffering. And so most philosophers would agree that free will theodicy speaks to the question of the logical problem of evil. But what Harry raises, and which I agree with as well, is it gets more difficult when you come to the question of horrendous suffering. So the Bible can say, yes, God created a world with free beings. This creates the possibility of suffering. But where it's really challenging for Christians is, well, what about really horrendous instances of evil for which there seem to be absolutely no good reason for this tragedy or for that tragedy? And there's a few, and I think that's probably where the argument and the discussion's going to lie. Let me say a couple things in relation to that. The first is, I've experienced this as well. When I've lost family members due to early deaths, I've cried out to God, why, God, why? I've discovered, actually, that's a question that's found in the pages of the Bible itself as well. People in the Bible cry out, why, God, why? And God doesn't actually smite them. He cares. Secondly, when we look at the world around us, with all the suffering that Harry talked about, he, myself, every single one of us here, there is an instinct deep within all of our souls which says, the way the world is with all its suffering, it's not the way that it should be. Christianity, the Bible affirms that instinct, that the way the world is not the way that it should be, and it tells us why. My question would be, if there is no God, if there's nothing more than, let's say, blind evolutionary biological mechanisms at work, and I do believe in evolutionary biological mechanisms, but I also believe that there is not blindness behind, there's a God behind. But if it's just blind biological evolutionary mechanisms, from where cometh this instinct that the way this world is not the way that it should be? Christianity can answer that. I don't think a worldview devoid of God can answer that very easily.
Brilliant. So Harry, I guess belief in God is one thing, but obviously part of the Epicurean dilemma is the goodness of God. Why is it that if there's suffering, God can't be good?
So, okay, great question. So I guess there is an assumption that God, capital G, is going to be omnipotent, can do everything. Now, firstly, it starts to get very philosophical very quickly, but what is your definition of omnipotence? And you can always do the fun games of, can God make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? Well, if he can't lift it, well, then, he can't be omnipotent. And, if he can't create a rock so heavy he can't lift it, well, then that's another thing he can't do. So you can start to play fun games with that. But most people will come to some definition of omnipotence and stick by it. There are a very small number of people that would accept, okay, a God exists, but he can't do everything. He can do a lot of things. He's kind of powerful, or he's kind of loving, but most people would kind of, when they're talking about God, they're assuming it's going to be the Abrahamic God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So that's kind of where, I guess, especially with the time limit on this discussion, I'm going to be making that assumption that it's kind of an all or nothing, one or the other, but obviously different options exist. So I'd just like to respond to, firstly, the point around free will. You mentioned that kind of the majority of academic philosophers think that free will has kind of buried the logical problem of evil. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. So if you look at, there was a really interesting 2020 survey of 1,800 academic philosophers. We're talking kind of published, proper philosophers at universities, not just me. But only 19% of those believed that free will, they either accepted that free will exists or they leant towards the concept that free will exists. So about 81% didn't even accept that what's called libertarian free will, the ability to do otherwise, that you actually have a meaningful choice between a tuna sandwich or a cheese sandwich, that it actually exists and you could have done differently. So if that's the case, if the vast majority of philosophers don't even accept that free will exists, how can it be then that the logical problem of evil is defeated by the idea that, well, free will exists? So there's that problem, but then that's kind of an appeal to popularity. That's just, of course, philosophers have spent a lot of time thinking about these things, but that doesn't mean they're right. So what are some of the problems with the free will defense? It only answers what's known as the moral evil that exists in the world, that is, I punch, not that I'm going to, Simon, and that causes him suffering. The vast majority of suffering out there is not moral evil, it's natural evil. So you mentioned you believe in evolution by natural selection, for which I'm very grateful, because it is an unquestionable, well, everything's questionable, but it is a established beyond reasonable doubt by a long shot as a scientific explanation for a vast amount of observations in lots of different scientific fields. But it raises a lot of questions. The mechanism of evolution is suffering. Over 99% of all species that have ever existed since life first emerged on Earth, since 3.8 billion years ago, have gone extinct. That's 5 million species. That's a lot of pain, that's a lot of suffering, and that's also before anyone ever even makes a choice. If you're asking, can human beings make a truly free decision? We have souls, we have the ability to make moral decisions, unlike a platypus or a little plankton or something. We actually have moral free will. There's enormous suffering there that is not answered by the free will defense. There's also other questions, and again we get into the fun realms of thought experiments and philosophy. So can God create a truly free moral agent like us, where we only choose to do good things? Is that possible? I would argue, yes, it is possible. And you can ask this question, for example, when it comes to the concept of heaven. Will there be suffering in heaven? Will there be evil in heaven? Well, no, there won't be, I assume, is going to be your answer. But then how can there be true free will? Then there's not free will anymore. Free will has been taken away, and therefore, in some sense, it's not valuable to God? I don't know. That's another thought, a fun thought that I guess you could have. I have other objections, but I'll pass over.
Thanks, Harry. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm aware we've probably got like 15 minutes before we want to go to Q&A.
Okay.
But I think the idea of natural suffering is a really big one. The fact that it's not just the problem of evil, where you can see someone's hand doing the damage, but the natural suffering of cancers or whatever it is, and that question of it not just being about the existence of God, but actually it's about his character. His character is at stake here as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Very briefly on the three. The first one, the free will. What you said doesn't negate the argument that the free will defense is a defeater to the logical problem of evil. Just because everyone doesn't believe in free will doesn't mean that if free will exists, it would be a defeater to the logical problem of evil. And so, as it's an argument in logic, you only need to say if free will exists, that would be a defeater. Free will exists within the Christian worldview, therefore for the Christian worldview it's not a defeater. In relation to natural suffering, I agree that there's been lots of pain and suffering, but like you, I also agree that philosophers distinguish between moral suffering and natural suffering. And so what you could say is, if there is a distinction between moral suffering and natural suffering, there's nothing immoral about natural suffering, because it's not moral suffering, it's natural suffering. It just is. If it's not immoral, then it doesn't pose a challenge rationally to the existence of a moral God. You would have to demonstrate there's something about that natural suffering that actually makes it a moral evil. And a lot of people wouldn't grant that it's a moral evil. It's just part of the way that nature is. I'm only doing these very short. It's a bit disservice to everything that you've said, but I'm trying to keep it brief. The third thing is, can God create free agents that only do good? I do not possibly see how someone could have free will and also only possibly do good. The example that you gave of heaven is not an appropriate one, because from a biblical perspective, heaven is a place where people chose to be there because they wanted God. They weren't made to go there. And having chosen at the core of their being to be there, there is now nothing that prevents them from living out what is their deepest core desire, which is to love, worship, and honor God. So I get where you're trying to go with that argument in terms of, oh, could that be a defeater? Here's where you can have free agency, but you always have to do good. But that's not how Christians understand heaven. Would you like me to make it even harder for myself and just say, well, and what about examples of horrendous evils, where you look at these evils and there's just absolutely no reason you could imagine for why God allowed this tragic circumstance to occur or this tragic circumstance. And I have to put all my cards on the table as a Christian and say, the Bible doesn't give us all the answers to all those questions. It tells us why there is suffering in the world generally, but it doesn't give us enough information to say why God allowed this instance of suffering or that instance of suffering. In philosophy, there is a defense to horrendous suffering, which is called skeptical theism. And the defense of skeptical theism is that just because you yourself cannot see what the reasons are for something occurring doesn't mean that there are no good reasons. Now, skeptical theism actually happens in the Bible, in the Book of Job. This character Job suffers all sorts of horrendous evils for no reason that's apparently good to him. He puts his case to God and God doesn't answer, and eventually God does answer, but God doesn't answer by telling Job why he experienced all these horrendous instances of suffering. All God does is say to Job, and this is basically an argument of skeptical theism, which is, were you there when I put the universe together? Do you understand how complex this world is? You possibly couldn't. You're finite. You're a human being. I'm the only person who could possibly understand every single human being, every single choice, every single ramification for every single choice, every single thing that would keep free will and that would lose free will. I'm the only one who can do this. You can't judge the big picture, only I can. And essentially what God's saying is, you're not a being capable of understanding the reasons, even if I was to explain them to you. And I found that hard when I read it. I found it quite unsatisfactory. I wanted reasons. But actually it reminded me of an experience that I had. This will take 2 minutes to share, which is when I took my daughter Grace to hospital when she was 18 months old and she was to get vaccinated. And I was really nervous because you have to sit your child on your lap and allow the nurse to come and stick the needle in your child's arm. And what I was really nervous about was that my daughter Grace, who's only 18 months old, would see that I'm allowing this person to hurt her with this needle and that she would think that I didn't love her anymore. So I was really nervous. So when the nurse put the needle in Grace's arm, Grace's face immediately went red. And then she started crying. And then she was like looking at me and she couldn't say anything. But what I could tell from her eyes was, why? Why, Daddy, are you allowing this to happen to me? And the reality was, she was only 18 months old. She couldn't possibly understand, even if I tried to explain it to her, why I was allowing this to happen. But it didn't mean that there weren't any reasons. It just meant that she wasn't of an age where she was capable of understanding. But thankfully, as I looked at her face and saw the question, why, what I didn't see was the question, do you love me anymore? She still knew that I loved her. She just didn't get how I could love her and be allowing this to happen. But the reason that she still loved me, I believe, it wasn't a blind faith. It was a faith based on the evidence of my love for her from the very first day of her life. Now, from where I stand as a Christian, even though we don't have reasons to know why God allowed this particular horrendous instance of suffering or this one, I do believe that we have good reason to believe that there are good reasons, even if we won't understand them this side of heaven. The primary one being not only that God's ways are higher than our ways and he knows everything in ways that we can't, but also because of the person of Jesus Christ. If Christianity is true, then God entered into human history as a person and experienced what it is to suffer and be tortured and die for you and for me. If Jesus Christ expresses the character of the heart of God, then I believe personally that I do have good reasons to trust him, even in the midst of tragic circumstances that this side of heaven, I, in my being, can't possibly see what the good reasons for them being allowed for. It's an act of faith, but I do think it's a reasonable faith based on the evidence, just like my daughter Grace's faith in me, if that makes sense.
Interesting that Simon sort of honed in on the person of Jesus there, and we do another podcast called The Matters of Life and Death, and there was a really interesting quote that apparently it's anonymous, but it comes from the hospice movement, which is that suffering's not a question that needs an answer, it's not a problem that needs a solution, it's a mystery that needs a presence, which I suppose for quite a few Christians they would talk about Jesus being the presence. So I want you to respond to what Simon said in like 2 minutes, but I also just wonder what you make of how Jesus does the person of Jesus impact how you think about the problem of suffering at all?
Sure, thanks. So I guess there are things that I would like to just very quickly respond to. So essentially, what you labelled skeptical theism, God's reasons are almost unknowable, at least this side of death. I don't know whether you'd say he will explain in the life to come, but I think, again, this breaks either omnipotence, that he can't explain to us, because you're a great dad. I saw him being a dad yesterday in Pizza Express. He's a great dad, but he's limited in what he can communicate to a 5-year-old. God is not, if he's omnipotent. He is able to communicate anything to anyone, no matter how limited they are. So he could communicate to us the reasons for our suffering, but evidently either chooses not to or thinks that it's better for us not to know, which I find hard to reconcile with omnibenevolence. So going to your question of Jesus, I think that his teachings are, I guess, very difficult to summarise, but I think they're fantastic in many respects, and I agree with many of them, and admire things like, the Good Samaritan, and I've read the Gospels many, many times. That's always, a parable that has a soft spot for me. But I don't think Jesus' teachings are unblemished at all. The example, I guess, that I would give, and particularly since we've touched on heaven, is, say, in Matthew 7, where Jesus says, broad is the gate that leads to destruction, and many go there. But narrow is the way of life, and few find it. Now, depending, and again, it's telling, I think, that God hasn't necessarily clarified what the nature of hell is, but it's either, from some Christians, eternal conscious torment, or some kind of just permanent death. But either way, in some ways, the answer of Christianity to suffering, I think, is almost the most intense and eternal suffering that you can essentially have for the greatest number. And in some ways, I do ask, is it moral to actually bring children into the world if you think that it is more probable than not that they will go to hell? And again, depending on the criteria of whether or not you go to heaven or hell, that hasn't necessarily been easily clarified in the 2,000 odd years that we've had theologians pondering over those issues. So I think that if this is Jesus' teaching, I don't think that it is, and I wouldn't say we know for definite what Jesus taught about things like heaven and hell, but I think the concept of hell is repugnant and is antithetical to the idea of omnibenevolence. I don't think it's necessary that there should exist a hell. It's incompatible. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
That's a massive topic, and I think if we can, maybe in the Q&A, get to the afterlife and whether that's just wishful thinking or whether it is a genuine hope. But just before we get to the Q&A, one of the things that, I guess we've talked about evil, we've talked about natural suffering. One of the things that I suppose is in the news a little bit at the moment, if anyone's following that, is suffering at the hands of Christians. I mean, Simon, as the resident Christian here, how do we respond to that? That it's not just suffering that's out there in the big wide world, but actually we're seeing Christians or alleged Christians actually being the perpetrators of suffering. How do we account for that?
Yeah, that's very hard. I got to hear a little bit of Harry's story last night. I didn't get a chance to share some of mine, but this is something I very much had to face very early on as a new Christian. The person that I learnt when I first started going to church for the first, say, 18 months, the person that I was learning the most about the Bible from, asked if he could give me a telephone call at a certain time, and I said sure, and he called me to say, I'm really sorry to tell you that I've been arrested for being a pedophile. And I was shocked, because this is someone who had been teaching me about the Bible. And so at a very early age as a Christian, I had to think about what did it mean that the person I'd been learning about Jesus from turned out to be a criminal in a really bad way, a terrible way. And I had to work out, did that take away from who Jesus was and what the Bible was? And I had to process that. And so what I would say to anyone here who's been hurt by the church or by people who call themselves Christians, I would just say, I'm so sorry that you've experienced that. I know a little bit of what that's like, and it's terrible. Hypocrisy in the church is terrible, and Jesus spoke against hypocrisy. He doesn't like it as well. And what I would also say, I think, is that I wouldn't want anyone missing out on the love of God through Jesus Christ because of the actions of someone who called themselves a Christian. There's an analogy it's a very raw, it's a very imperfect analogy, so forgive me for that, but it tries to capture something of what I'm trying to say, which is if you love football, and football's great, but one day you were attacked by a gang of football hooligans, it might be that emotionally and for a very long time you might say, I hate football, I hate everything to do with football. But over time you would have to work out, is there something about the game of football itself that lends itself to football hooliganism and violence? Or does hooliganism come from somewhere other than football? And I think you would agree it comes from somewhere other than football. If you look at the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings that talk about looking after the weak and looking after the vulnerable and looking after children and loving and not hurting and not being selfish, Jesus hated the sort of hypocrisy that we also hate as well. So I just finish again with reiterating that I'd hate anyone to miss out on the genuine love of God that we can experience in Jesus Christ because of something that someone has done who's called themselves a Christian has done to you.
We're going to take a quick break before we dive into live audience questions from the young people at St Michael's School. If you're enjoying the debate and watching it on YouTube, then please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, then please give us a follow. We'll be back in just a moment.
I recently saw Richard Dawkins, sort of embarrassingly. I sort of said I was actually at Evensong last night, and he said, me too.
It's not as if I ever looked at a supermarket shelf of religions and said, I think I'll have that one. I found this continued to unfold and make the best sense I could imagine.
The person of Jesus compels me. Is life all suffering? Is it all love? No, it's both. It's both. And in this story, they are held in this. I find it beautiful.
The way I think of Christianity is that in the person of Jesus, God and us and the universe came together in a unique and unparalleled way.
You're supposed to be atheists. Christians.
This has all happened since you invited me, sorry. Sorry.
Don't worry, I haven't become an atheist.
There's now one atheist on the panel.
I've got some bad news.
Welcome back to the second part of today's episode of the Unbelievable podcast. We're going to now open the floor to our student audience for a live Q&A. Let's dive in with our first question. If free will exists, then why is hell used as a punishment?
Yes, so like I said, I didn't grow up in a religious family, so it took me a little bit of time to unpick some of the assumptions that I had about what Christians believed about hell. I suppose that before I looked into it a little bit more, I would have thought that Christians believe that there's, that people in the world can roughly be divided into two lots, the good people and the bad people. And if you're a good person above a certain amount of morality, you get to go at the end of your life to a good place, heaven, where you'll experience good things. And if you're a bad person, sort of below a certain line, then you'll have to go to a bad place and experience bad things, heaven, hell, places. As a Christian, I've come to discover that hell in the Bible is quite different to that it's actually, Jesus says, it's not about how good you are or think you are, or whether you can earn your way by morality to be good enough to get into the good place. Because Jesus lived the perfect life that we could never live, died the perfect death on the cross in our place, in order that he's done everything that needs to be done. He's made the way. And so Christianity, you might think of it as an open invitation to a relationship with the God who made you and who loves you, to spend eternity with him. Now, heaven is less a place that you go to. It's more being with God, who is the source of all goodness. And if the invitation is extended to everyone, it's not about how good you are, it's whether you say yes to that invitation. You might just think of heaven as the place of people who said yes to the source of goodness. Hell, rather than thinking of it as a place, is the natural outcome of people who say no to goodness, to the source of all goodness. Now, the problem is, if you're anything like me, you might not immediately recognize Christianity or God or Jesus as the source of all goodness. It took me some time, and I'm not here to tell anyone, you have to believe what I believe. What I say to people is, every single person has to investigate these things for themselves, which is what I did and where I landed. And so free will is very much a part of it. It's an invitation extended to us. The question is not, does God want us? God has answered that in Jesus Christ. God loves you. He wants you. The question is, do we want God? Do we want that?
Can I just quickly, as an awkward question, would you say that the majority of people are destined for hell? What is your response to Matthew 7?
Yeah, thank you. So Matthew 7, if you just reminder, is the one that says, broad is the way that leads to destruction, narrow is the way that leads to life. So I've looked at various commentators on this passage, and some commentators go in the direction that you said, which was this refers, it's very much statistics. It refers to how many people will go there, how many people will go there. Other commentators say this very much refers to the path, that there's an easy way to go, which is the way of self and just regard to self, and there's a hard way to go, which is like, it's not just about self, it's about letting someone else to be the boss of your life, and that's hard. It's easy just to go with the stream. It's hard to go different. It's easy to sort of look down and look ahead. It's hard to look up and think about God. And the reason commentators take that approach is because you have to balance it with the rest of the Bible. And in the rest of the Bible, you've got just so many passages saying, Christ died for all, that when Paul, the Apostle Paul, was speaking to a group of people who weren't Christians in Greece, in Athens, he said that God has placed each and every person in the time and place that he's put them in order that they might reach out to God, and in reaching out, finding God. In other words, God wants us to find them. All throughout the Bible it says, if you seek, you will find. If you knock, the door will be open. So on the one hand, you've got these things that are suggesting it's not easy. It's hard. You've got to carry your cross. You've got to count the cost. You've got to deny yourself. On the other hand, you've got just an incredible overture of God's love, saying again and again and again, you're not here by accident, you're here on purpose. I wanted you to be here. I want a relationship with you. You're an eternal being made for an eternal future in universe with me. Come to me. This is why I came into the world through Jesus. And that is so inclusive as an invitation. It doesn't make it easy.
Firstly, to what extent is that falsifiable is something for you to think about. And then the second thing I would say is it would be quite handy if God could have clarified the meaning of those very important verses.
Okay, that's a great question. So in terms of evolution, the fact that a lot of it came about via chance, and actually the way our brains formed is even to do with chance. How can't we just say that suffering is a product of chance?
Yeah, I just said at the start, you guys asked really good questions. I appreciate it. So a really helpful distinction that we need to make is between the belief that evolutionary biological mechanisms have happened completely unguided. There's no mind behind the beginning of the universe and the laws which enable those sort of mechanisms to operate. The sort of laws that were in operation within nanoseconds of the beginning of the universe at the Big Bang, which over time would lead to these sort of mechanisms. Now, you might say that's completely unguided, it's completely chance in a way. That word's ambiguous, but let's just say chance, there's no mind behind it. Or you might take the position I do, which is there is a mind at the bottom of the universe. The fact that you have minds makes sense that at the foundation of the universe there is a mind behind the mechanisms that led to the creation of mind in you. If there was no mind underpinning the mechanisms that eventually led to mind, how did pure physical mechanisms suddenly transcend themselves to know that they exist and you have mind in addition to matter? And so the distinction is between what we might say is guided evolution or unguided evolution. If it's guided, it means that there's purpose, but it also means part of the purpose could be some degree of parameters of chance, of freedom in a way. And certainly that's the Christian worldview, that it's not like everything is like you're not puppets on a string. It's not that extreme. But on the other hand, it's not completely random and chance. There is mind and there is purpose behind me and behind you.
I reckon we've got time for one more question before we pause and let people go. Yeah, that's a brilliant question. So if someone is born with a disease or a disability, how does that make God good if he let that happen? Thank you. That's a great question.
Yes. God has made it really clear in the way that he interacts with people in the Bible who you might say things didn't work out for them exactly as maybe they might have wanted. It didn't work out perfectly with disabilities, with diseases, with physical challenges. And one of the things that attracted people to the person of Jesus Christ is the way that he didn't exclude or look down on people the way society might tend to do. He saw the core of who we are. And I've got lots of friends who experience challenges in one way or the other that I don't experience. It might be to do with hearing, it might be to do with sight. And something that God's helped me learn is that things that we might straight away think are a disability, in some purposes which are still in some sense mysterious, but I sometimes think I can get a little bit of a grasp of it, is that we're able to see things through each other that we couldn't have seen if everything and everyone just worked out the same. Also, just finish with saying that I've many people who follow Jesus who struggle with things that I don't struggle with, who have a hope also that the struggles of this life are not the entirety of life. This world is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And one day there shall come a time when everything shall be put right, and there shall be full restoration and everything made new. So we live in hope, but in the meantime, we live in purpose, and everything has meaning when you do it with God. Nothing is wasted, if that makes sense.
Do you know Sally Phillips, the comedian? She's got a son who's got Down syndrome, and she talks about the topsy-turvy kingdom of God, where everything's kind of, you know, not the way that we'd think it was, but she talks about the fact that she has actually learned so much about God and about Jesus and about how inclusive his love is through her son Ollie, who's got Down syndrome. So that's just another thing to throw into the mix. Has anyone else got any questions? Yeah. I guess the difference between believing in God or not believing in what he does.
So I guess when we're having this conversation, everyone is assuming capital G, God, and therefore there are certain assumptions that come with that, like omnipotence and omnibenevolence, omniscience and omnipresence, and all the omnis, the omni-God I sometimes call him, assuming that it's a him. But that's not necessarily the case. There obviously people have different beliefs that, it may be the case that, say, God is not actually omnipotent. There are some things he cannot do. And defining omnipotence, you can go into theology and philosophy and have lots of fun debates. So, for example, in the Bible it says that God cannot lie. And you go, hang on a minute, why? Is that something he can't do, so he's not omnipotent? Or is it the case that he wouldn't want to, so it's not part of his nature? So is omnipotence, he can't do anything that is contrary to his nature? So there's lots of different definitions of omnipotence. So it's not as cut and dry, and this is why philosophy, theology are all really interesting subjects. Yeah, go on, I can see you've got an...
Oh, just to say, so the...
And just sorry, 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, agnostic atheism, most people love to actually, like at Dawkins, oh no, God definitely doesn't exist. So I'm not one of those. I say, I don't believe in God, not there is no God. I don't see a reason to believe. There might be a reason, and if Simon tells me a reason, I'll change my mind. But I also don't claim to know. That's what I mean when I say agnostic atheism.
But also, just to clarify, there was a time when you did believe.
There was a time when I was not just the same, but I was. That
not
would
as
be
old.
odd.
Just better looking.
Yeah, yeah, true. I used to be an evangelical Christian, very committed, and I changed my mind. I'm very happy to change it back. But now I hand over.
Oh yeah, so another good way of thinking about omnipotence from God's perspective that helps cut through the idea of can he, will he, is that there is nothing outside of God that constrains or restricts him. The only thing that would constrain or restrict God would be his own choice, which derives from him. So then you start asking questions like, not so much can God do this, but does he want to? And then you start like, well, if he's good, would he want to do this or want to do that? And so that was a good question.
A really good question.
Yeah.
Then you can have equal fun with what is God's nature? Can he change his own nature? Could he change his own wants if he wanted to? So you can play a lot of fun experiments when it comes to defining these things. And
it will hurt your brain.
And it will start to hurt your brain after a while. And there's also the other thing, I guess I would say, is that there's the fun philosophy, the thought experiments, these conversations, but there's also practical things that you can do around the problem of suffering. We didn't really get to touch on that too much. That was on our list, but we didn't have enough time. So that's one thing that me and Simon and Ruth will all share in common, that there are real tangible things you can do, support charities. I volunteered for a while at a Christian food bank, even when I wasn't a Christian. There are lots of things you can do against suffering collaboratively. It doesn't have to be all antagonistic. It can be very collaborative and nice.
But great question. Thank you.
Sincerely, I know sometimes people say, oh yeah, that was a great question. A lot of people always say that, but it was a genuinely good question. So thank you.
Simon, whether you had a response to what Harry was saying, could you communicate your reasons and explain why God allows suffering, even to someone of limited intelligence? Yes, because you couldn't communicate to Grace that the injection was good for her.
Yes.
So, yeah, why can't God communicate?
If God's all powerful, surely he could find a way to communicate the reasons. Yeah, so really this borders into really speculative territory for two reasons. One of which is, in saying that God could just make it so that though we're not beings that could understand the complexity of the reasons behind what he allows, he could make it that we are beings that are such that can understand the complexity, and therefore he could communicate to us. And that to me seems to be bordering on the edge of asking God to create a square circle, to do something which is logically inconsistent. The sentence defeats itself. We're not beings who are of such that could understand it, but then he could make us understand it. Well, then we're no longer the beings who we are. So but he wants us to be the beings who we are. So it might be that we'd be asking God to do something which is logically inconsistent, which saying that God can't do something that is logically inconsistent isn't saying that God is limited in his power. It's just saying that such things don't exist. A square circle doesn't exist. It's not a derogation on God's power that he can't make one. It's just a nonsense in and of itself, semantically even. A second thing is that you could say that, look, there are just certain things that God might be able to communicate the reasons to us, but it might be that in communicating those reasons, it defeats other purposes that God has, the greater purposes of which we can't understand at this time. And as soon as you say, well, then he could explain those purposes, but then by doing that might defeat other purposes that he has as well. And so you find yourself in a situation where you're like, okay, I get God is in this very interesting dance that only he could possibly understand, where he is trying to deal with the root of the problem of suffering, which is the human heart. So suffering is the outflow of a deeper problem, which the Bible calls sin, and it's through sin that so much of suffering has come into the world. So God's primary purpose is not to get rid of suffering or to save us from suffering, it's to save us from sin. But in order to save us from sin, he can't just do it in a way that goes, zap, you're a different person now. That would defeat the whole process of salvation. That salvation almost needs to come from us. So he's in this interesting dance where he's trying, not by power and not by might, but by love, to transform us from the inside out. And who of us on earth could possibly comprehend what he could and couldn't allow in terms of the limits of our free will and our ability to hurt and not hurt each other in order to accomplish that? So which is why I'm like, okay, even just thought experiments, you start to imagine, oh, well, why didn't God just make a world where we couldn't really hurt each other? Like if I got really, really bad, I couldn't hurt anyone. Well, how's that going to affect me? You just think it through. Okay, well, when I get really, really mad, I'm going to vent that full anger at someone. I'm just going to go at them, knowing that every time I do, I can't really hurt them. But gee, I love trying. That's not going to deal with the root of the problem, which is the heart that wants to hurt them. How do you deal with that rather than just the hurt? And so that's the sort of complex interplay that God's at work, where I think at some point we just need some epistemic humility to say, I can't possibly comprehend how God could balance free will and salvation from within. At some point I just have to say, I won't have all the answers. There is some mystery. But thankfully, it's not complete mystery. It's not complete darkness. He doesn't give us complete light, but I do believe, and especially in Jesus, he gives us enough light to put our hand in his hand and to walk through him in the mystery and in the suffering with trust and with hope, knowing that he's got it covered. And one day it will all make sense. But in the meantime, I can trust a God who bled and died for me, because such a God is not capricious, he's not arbitrary, he genuinely cares, and he wants to help me, like you said, make a difference in this life in the meantime, to be an agent of healing and an agent of helping to alleviate people from pain and suffering. If that makes sense. That's how I see it, but it's complex philosophically, isn't it?
I was leaving that to you.
Not my problem to fix.
To some extent, theology does go into the speculative, the area of unfalsifiability, and that's an area where I guess you do have to kind of throw your hands up. And yeah.
I mean, like, you have just tried to ask yourself, like, what would I do if I was God?
Well, yeah, exactly.
And if you've ever watched Bruce Almighty, you'll know that it's not as easy as you think. Although the ability to just say, "I'd love some freshly ground Colombian coffee," ready,
would be nice.
to use that power would be quite helpful. But yeah, it is tough. It's a really hard question. But for me, another thing that I come down to is, and you tell me if I'm rabbiting on, but the story of Leo Tolstoy. He was trying to make sense of life and its apparent meaninglessness in the face of sickness and suffering and death. And he spoke to all the greatest minds of his day, and he said the greatest answer that the greatest minds of his day could give in response to these questions was that in the infinity of space and the infinity of time, infinite particles mutate with infinite complexity. That's it. And he said he kept looking until he eventually found an answer in the peasant people of Russia, which was their simple faith in Jesus Christ. And I remember reading that for the first time and thinking, oh yeah, but they're simple faith, simple people, does that really hold up? But with all the philosophical arguments that we weigh, on top of that is the reality of the lived experience of human beings the tried and tested faith in Jesus Christ that works and that carries people through. And Tolstoy, as great as his intellect was, that's something that he just couldn't argue against because it was real. And I think that makes all the difference in the world as well.
Harry, as someone who's had like belief in God and non-belief in God, would you say that which one of those worldviews is the most satisfying when it comes to the problem of suffering?
I would say Christianity gave me, and like you said, I was to some extent, to all extent, was very happy with the apologetics around, okay, well, we can't go, right, that instance of suffering, I know the answer, but there's a whole bundle of answers here, and it will probably be one of those or one that, we just haven't fathomed. And that made things a lot tidier and easier. But I would also, it springs to mind the whole C.S. Lewis when he wrote around comfort, and if I wanted a religion that made me feel comfortable, I wouldn't choose Christianity. I would choose, I think, a fireplace with port and a good book. And I think that's true. But I would say Christianity, but equally there are areas of solace in a naturalist kind of framework, and I guess it's also a case where I can't convince myself based on utility or pragmatism. It's like Pascal's wager. I can't go, well, I would like to get into heaven, so I'll just change my beliefs and accept the gospel. It's like, I always give the example, well, if you can choose what you believe, we don't have epistemic freedom, if you like. I can't choose to not believe in the theory of gravity and exit instead of through the door, through the fifth story window.
You could try.
I could try, and then I would be selected for very quickly out of existence. So I can't change. I'm either convinced or I'm not.
And do you feel like,
and I have to just take comfort where I can. Not
to put you on the spot, but do you feel like there is anything that could convince you back again? Would there be one like knockdown argument or experience or something that would suddenly make you think, oh, perhaps there is something in this Christianity thing?
Many people have asked me that, and in fact you did last time.
Did I?
Recall.
I've only got one question, guys.
It's not as simple as that. It is the case that, we're, as worldview kind of construction, there's so many different aspects. So okay, well, imagine that I have a grand vision of Jesus and whatever, would I respond to that and go, wow, I've had a grand vision of Jesus and he spoke to me and he gave me lots of different, wondrous signs or whatever. Would I just doubt that? As, we have so many psychological, logical biases, sociological, all of these things. Or would I accept it? I don't really know. It depends on the experience that I had. And will it be the case that, some historical piece of evidence comes forwards and raises the probability that Jesus rose from the dead? I can't, it's not like physics or biology where you have kind of confidence intervals and, your alpha and your beta values, if you want to get into your statistics. It's something where that doesn't apply. So I just have to kind of go, well, what's reasonable to expect here? What makes good sense?
Yeah, because you said, I think you said last night, I do believe Christianity is a reasonable faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's obviously not everyone
It can be reasonable.
It can be reasonable, yeah.
Not always.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say it can be reasonable, you're not distinguishing between different types of Christianity, you're distinguishing between different types of people and how much evidence they particularly have received. Is that
both?
Both. Okay.
Yeah, both.
So from a let's say worldview perspective, even though that word's quite blunt, worldview, but from a worldview perspective, you would say there's nothing about the Christian belief that makes it irrational. But we would say there might be some people who are Christians who believe it irrationally because maybe they've just accepted it from their parents or something like that. So here's a just question that comes to mind, and it's curiosity. It's not a gotcha question or anything like that. If you believe it's a reasonable worldview, have you ever thought about, well, how much evidence would make it reasonable for me? Like, have you ever thought about the different degrees of certainty that different people require, and whether that might differ from person to person? And do you have a sense of how much certainty you think you need, even in terms of like a percentage? Or
it's really difficult because it's just not how it works. It's like in law, for example, you have beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes.
But there's
no one's put that a percentage on that.
Exactly.
Although people have written about it.
Well, yeah.
It's also harder as well because it's not like you're coming from nothing.
Yeah.
You're coming from having had a belief and presumably you did have a certain amount of certainty and probability and all of it lining up, and then it fell down. So it's not like there was no belief. Once you get all these certainties, there will be belief.
Yeah.
So
I guess, where, if you'd asked me age 18 or 19, how certain are you of the Christian faith, I would say very, very, very confident. Sure, I could be, a brain in a vat, or deceived by Descartes' demon, but, there are certain things that you have to kind of go, okay, I can't prove that. But in the functional world in which we live, then I'll just take those axioms, and those are the smallest I, can get. It's like with now, I kind of go, well, can I prove the law of non-contradiction? No, it's just kind of the minimalist axiom that I can get.
That
another fun thought experiment: could God create a true contradiction? That's always a fun one.
On that note, I feel like we're probably done here with all of our philosophical musings. No?
Just the recorded.
We're just done with the recording. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
You've both shared really vulnerably. I can't say that word. Vulnerably. Still can't say that word. And honestly, so really, really appreciate both of you. Thank you so much.
To explore more thought-provoking discussions on life, religion, philosophy, science, and everything else in between, visit premierunbelievable.com. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, then please do consider giving the show a follow. And if you've got any further questions on this topic or others, then why not drop us a direct message on social media? We would love to hear from you, and we may include your questions in upcoming shows. Thank you so much for joining us today, and see you next time.